Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. My name is Brianna and this is For a Pause in a Book. I make bookish videos over here on my little corner of the internet, so if that's something that you're interested in, make sure that you hit the subscribe button down below. Today we are going to be talking about the 10 books that I read for SPFBO 9. If you are new here, SPFBO or SPFBO is a competition where 300 self-published books are put in a battle of sorts to come out on top as the best self-published fantasy book of the year. This is created by Mark Lawrence and I am on one of the judging teams. Cassidy over at Covers with Cassidy is one of the official judges, and she asked a few of us to be on her team and kind of cull through the 30 books that she received in her judging panel. Of the 30 books in her group, I had 10 of them. There was also one other judge in her group that also read these books. So there were 2 people that read each book, giving each book a fair shot. That way, if a book didn't work for one person, but it might have worked for another, it still had a shot of going forward. Each of us were given the task of whittling this list down to one book and giving Cassidy a semi-finalist. So today we're going to be doing that. But I am going to be talking about all 10 of these. So of the 10, I completed 8 of them. There were 2 that I DNF'd. We're going to talk about those first. Then I'm going to talk about the next 6 books that I completed but are not contenders, and then the final 2 contenders, and then I'll finally announce my semi-finalist. That's how this video is going to work. The first book that I DNF'd is The Nightingale Prince by Zach Bell. This is a queer fae romance, and I really wanted to like this. The concept sounded really intriguing. Obviously, bonus points for it being queer. We need more of that representation. We need more queer representation in fantasy. I will die on that hill. This book is a little bit cozy, but a lot of trauma, which kind of was a little bit of a juxtaposition to kind of work through. I mean, the book opens up with a character making cookies, but that character has gone through some stuff. Unfortunately for me, the writing style did not really work out for me, and I ended up DNFing this book at about 25%. The author was trying to do so much in such a short amount of time that it really felt like this was the bare bones of a novel, but it kind of needed to be fleshed out a little bit more. There were some discrepancies in some of the world building that just kind of left things open-ended. And I know this is the first book in a series, so like the plot, like stuff in the plot I'm okay with being left open-ended, but it was stuff in like the world building and like just like the way that the mansion was designed or talked about just kind of left me with some questions. Also, some of the characters would do things that kind of didn't feel like their character would have done that, and there just wasn't any explanation to it. Book number 2 that I DNF'd was Oppanumbra by N.R. Gravel. This was another book that like really intrigued me at the beginning. The prologue was written very well, like it was very polished, but then as we kind of got a little bit farther in, it felt like there was less polish, kind of like they worked on the first couple of chapters so much and then didn't continue that level of editing through the rest of the book. I was getting really lost, and it kind of felt like the author was getting lost too. There are books where like I'm okay with being lost with the entire book, but if the author also feels lost, then I struggle with it. Like I said, the concept of this is pretty interesting. It's very like Tolkien inspired, but with some dragons. But I do think that this book just needed a little bit more refinement. Now let's talk about the books that I did finish. So book number 3 on my list, and these next 6 are not in any order other than just the order that I wrote my notes in. So we have Beta by M.T. Zemi, and this is a YA coming of age story, but like also what if you were involved with superheroes? This has a really interesting world building system where we have the apex people that have like some sort of superpowers, and then the betas that do not. This is a really fun story, and I think that it would compare to the Renegades trilogy by Marissa Meyer. So if you like that trilogy, I think you might really enjoy this. It has a lot of fun, like high school angst, the drama, the like, you know, the mundane stuff of like going to school and stuff like that, but then like paired with you know, superheroes. It has a lot of those like fun vibes, but also the implications of dealing with like a superhero being at your school and trying to blend in. They are definitely different stories. Like it's definitely a different story than Renegades, but I can see that if you like one, you might like the other. There's a very large cast of characters in this, and that was a lot of fun. You're kind of seeing secrets being unfolded as the book goes along, and it's a nice blend between like, oh my goodness, we have to save the world, with like family dinner. So like the pacing I think was done really well. The main characters are definitely teenagers, and it's definitely realistic to some of the things that they have to worry about. The book is messy, not in like the writing, but like in their relationships and things like that. It is the first book in a series, and it does end in a way where you want to continue on with the series immediately, which I really appreciate, especially in like YA type stories like this. Personally, my struggle with this book came from it feeling more like a sci-fi book than a fantasy book, at least for the purpose of this competition. Everything else felt fantasy. This one felt more sci-fi with its talk of technology and DNA and brain manipulation and things like that. So I feel like this book probably would have been better suited in a sci-fi sort of competition like this. I still enjoyed this book, and I definitely recommend that you pick it up if you like this type of story. Book number 4 is Otter Still by D.N. Bryan, and this is another queer fantasy romance, so we were living our best life here this month. This is a queer fantasy romance with a side of venom. You know, the Marvel, like, Venom with a parasite. That's like the comp title for this, and I kind of enjoyed that. This book is comped, like I said, as a fantastical version of Venom with a sentient parasite as part of our main character, which is a really interesting and unique take and not something that you see very often in fantasy books. There's so much representation in this book, which is, again, something that I really appreciate in fantasy books. So obviously LGBTQ plus characters, but also BIPOC characters. There is mental health representation, anxiety rep, chronic illness, like all of the things, and I really appreciated that. This world is super descriptive. It is a steampunk underwater city, and I was here for that vibe. It's definitely not a world or magic system that I had read before. My struggle, again, with this book is just that it tried to do so many things. This book is not long at all, but because it had so many characters in it, but then it also had this like parasite, and then it also had this romance, and it also had this like main storyline. It was a lot, and I got a little lost. I think that if this book focused a little bit more heavily in one direction, it doesn't even matter which one, and then the other ones became more side plots, I do think that this story would have flowed a little bit better. Also, this book is the first book in this mini series, but it is book 3 in the larger world of this author. And because I went into this as the starting point, I did feel a little bit lost in as far as some of the nuances. Some of the things in the world didn't feel like they had been explained well, almost as if we should have already known certain things. So it's likely that some of that stuff was discussed in earlier books in the larger world, but because I'm reading this as a standalone or as a first book in a series, I kind of had to just go off of what this book had. Next up, we have Autumn Chaos by Elena Nitkin, and this is what looks like a fantasy romance with some cozy vibes. It's really not. It's much darker than that. This is about a hermit witch, and what I really liked about this character is despite the cover is not my favorite. I mean, it's beautiful, but in terms of what the book is, it's not exactly telling the right story. So this witch is not a young, beautiful ingenue. She's actually kind of a middle-aged badass hermit. Anyway, she has been exiled. She's been living the past decade out on the outskirts of town, living her best quiet life, which, like, you know, a mood. And then a half-dead warrior shows up on our doorstep. One thing leads to another. Now we're in the middle of a rebellion and a political uprising. Also, monsters. I really enjoyed our female main character. I love a badass character, and I also really appreciated that she wasn't like this young girl, that we actually had like an older, like aged up type main character in a romance. She was badass, take no shit kind of a witch. The world building was also really well done, and I think that the monsters that like added to this world really were well thought out. And like I said, the story is much darker than one might be led to believe. My struggle with this book came from the pacing of this book. This is definitely a book of two halves. The first half is slow going, and I almost DNF'd, but a lot of the reviews say that like, oh, the second half is so good, and they're right. The second half like really ramped up the pace, really ramped up the action, and I was invested at that point. But the first half was a slog. It was a struggle to get through. It's very slow. The way that the chapters are paced and laid out was just really confusing to my brain, and so overall the first half felt really clunky. And the problem is that once we got to the action of the second half, I felt like I was just along for the ride rather than really caring about what happened to each one of the characters. It is a first book in the series, and it does lead you to want to continue on in the series right away, so I do appreciate that. Next up, we have Speechless and Akinten by Debbie and Aku Haddad, and this is a really interesting YA with a really unique world building system. This city is built inside of the bony rib cage of an extinct monster. And so immediately I am intrigued by this. It's like kind of a desert type fantasy setting. There are also giant ants that they ride. So that's cool. The main character does not speak. It's not because of a disability, but it is part of her like magical curse that she has had on her, and she is essentially trying to find her voice. That is the point of the story. Despite not being able to speak, this protagonist is a badass. And again, a character that I really enjoyed. You can really connect with her despite her not speaking, and you can tell what her struggles are. You can really connect with her. The world building was definitely the strength of this book, but even so, because world building is such an important aspect to me, I wanted even more of it. It wasn't that I was missing anything, I just wanted more. You know, when a world is like so good, you just want to know like every facet of its information? My struggle with this is the overall vibe of this book. This book had some very high stakes, some very life and death situations. However, the vibe of all of the characters felt very campy, very high school drama. And I do believe that that is because it is kind of targeted at a younger YA audience, and this is kind of a bridge into YA fantasy. But the problem was is that when the character would get into like a near-death experience, it was a little bit jarring. It was a little bit like, wow, okay, we almost died there. But overall, this is definitely one that I would recommend, especially if you are a fan of YA fantasy. Next up, we have Lady of Ravensmere by Mary McKenna, and this is a Regency-inspired fantasy romance. It's got a lot of like political discussions and things like that. Essentially, this is about a young girl who is being kind of shipped up north to be betrothed to, you know, someone in a political alliance so that like their families will be allies of his. She's far from her family, she has very little support from her home, and you're kind of just like along for the ride with her. If you're a fan of the Regency style romance, I do think that this might work for you. It doesn't have as much of the like courtroom politics that I really enjoy in a political fantasy. This is definitely more of the social aspect, much like Regency romances are. So if you are a fan of that, I do think that this would work for you. The world is very vivid, and you do connect with your main character the entire time, and you really see the struggles that she's going through. So there's definitely an audience for this. Unfortunately, that audience is not necessarily me. Next up, we have Hearts Lost by Meredith Hart, and this is a new adult fantasy romance about a girl who is trying to save her sister, and she gets paired up with this assassin dude, and has to go on this journey to the lands below in order to like do this quest in order to save her sister. Of course, the assassin is also super sexy, so that's a plus. The strength of this book is the dialogue. The banter between the two main characters is phenomenal. And there were definitely times where I like highlighted, I laughed a little bit. It was like snarky and sarcastic. This is definitely a book that falls into the new adult category. I do really, really love the new cover. The old cover definitely made it feel YA, and so I went into it a little bit unaware of that. And so when the steamy scenes happened, I was caught off guard a little bit. But this one definitely feels a little bit more adult. This book is really fast-paced. I think I read half of it in one sitting on sprints one night. So it's very fast-paced, and it makes you kind of want to read more and more. So if you like the adventure type of books, this is definitely one that I would recommend picking up. Also, I kind of see Carissa Broadbent vibes. I think if you like Carissa Broadbent, it's a different story for sure than what she writes, but specifically in that dialogue and the banter between the two main characters, I definitely see how if you do like Carissa's books, you might like this one as well. This book is another one of those where it's supposed to be a standalone, and it can be read as a standalone. However, it's technically book 2 in a wider series. And so again, I did feel like we were missing some things. Unfortunately, because of that, I felt like we were missing a little bit of the nuance, especially of the world, that was probably explained or at least mentioned in the first book. Now let's talk about the 2 that were the highest contenders, and then of the 2, I will pick my semi-finalist that will continue on to Cassidy. First up, let's talk about The Sword of Mercy and Wrath. This is book 1 in a grimdark, I think it's a duology. There's 2 books out right now. I don't know though that there's gonna be more. This was kind of my first toe dip into a grimdark story. And you know, I have to say, after reading this, if this is what grimdark is, I would like to read more, please. This book plays with an author-created religion, which is a huge buzzword for me, and something that I very much enjoy. There are werewolves in this book, which are very smartly done. Sometimes they can be a little bit campy, but this one was done so well. The main character is not likable, which I guess is kind of a thing in a grimdark fantasy, but again, pretty new here to that world. In this book, you are kind of seeing the slow descent into madness that this main character is facing. She's really just trying to get revenge. But because of that slow descent that you are watching, you understand the choices that the character is making throughout. One of the things that I really appreciated in this book, and this also could be a thing with grimdark fantasy, I don't know, but there was no black and white. Like, there was no, this is good, this is bad, this is correct, this is incorrect. Everything was very muddled and very gray. Again, could be an aspect of most grimdark fantasy. My favorite part of this book has to be the disability representation. So our main character is missing an arm. That's not a spoiler. It's in the beginning of the book. But she is still portrayed as this complete badass. The disability does not affect her, like, the way that she does things. It's just part of who she is. She makes it work. She kicks ass. My only struggle with this book came, again, in the pacing. This book did not calm down, like, at all. Once we ramped up, I was exhausted. Not in a bad way, but, like, I'm sure the characters were also very exhausted. We were moving from one plot point to another, to another, to another. And this book is not large. I mean, I think it's like 400 pages maybe. Nope, 382. So, like, I think we could have had even like 50 to 75 pages more of just like some slowdown moments. That would have been nice. Just let me catch my breath. But still, overall, a fantastic book, and I will definitely be reading the second one in the series. And then our last contender is The Fires of Time by Alexander Wyatt. First off, can we have some commotion for the cover? She's stunning. This book is such a pleasant reading experience, and I think that that's kind of funny compared to the grim dark of the other, of Sword of Mercy and Wrath. But it has a really close group of POV characters. So we have this girl who is figuring out her magic. We have her grumpy mentor, and then we have her ghost friend. And all of them are so unique, and they have their own voice, and they have their own, like, unique style, and I really, really liked that. They have complex backstories that really dictate their choices and the actions that they make. We have our courtroom politics in this book, which I really, really appreciated. We got a little bit of backstabbing, we got a little bit of magic. The writing style and the prose is definitely the strength of this book. I tabbed this book. Can we appreciate that? Okay. There are several quotable lines in this book, and I was obsessed with the writing style. It kind of reminds me of the Daevabad trilogy, not in the plot, just in the tone of it. I was worried about this book going into it because it is a standalone fantasy, and a lot of times I get burned by those because we don't expand enough into things that I find really interesting because we kind of have to condense it into one single story. This has a complex world and a complex magic system, and so I was afraid that we weren't going to dive far enough into something. And while that's always a concern and there's always things that I would love to see more of, I do think that this does work as a standalone. The book focused on what was important, and you could clearly see the direction that the author was going. Another thing that I found really interesting about this book is that normally when we get to fight scenes or battle scenes or things like that, I do tend to skim, right? We know. X, you know, swing the sword, blah, 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 fight with magic, whatever. But I imagine that Alexander, like, acted out some of these scenes as they were writing it, because the scenes are explained so well, like, in a way that makes sense for characters. Because normally if you read it, you're like, wait a minute, how did he swing, like, with the sword behind your back? Like, physics, right? But this one, it just felt really realistic. Okay, so our two contenders are The Sword of Mercy and Wrath and The Fires of Time. These books could not be more different, honestly. They are different in style, in tone, in plot, in characters. There's so much that's different about this. And while I think that either one of these books would do really well continuing on, my official semi-finalist is going to be The Fires of Time by Alexander Wyatt. I really enjoyed this book. I had a great time reading it. It took me a little bit longer to read, but I think that's definitely a me thing, not a book thing. But I will definitely be reading more of what this author writes. So thank you so much to Cassidy for asking me to be a part of your team. This was such a fun experience, and I loved being able to be a part of the self-pub community. So often it's overlooked, and this is such a great experience and a great opportunity to get your name out as a self-published author. If any of these books sound interesting to you, I will have links down below to Amazon. A lot of these are on Kindle Unlimited, so if you have that, that's a great option for you. And I'm also going to be linking the other hosts that are on Cassidy's team, because a lot of them have already come out with their semi-finalist pick as well. Now it's Cassidy's turn to pick a finalist. That is all I got for you today. If you're new here and you have not yet subscribed, there is a little button that you can do so down below the video. If you'd like to hang out with me more, the links to my Instagram, Goodreads, Twitter, and my Patreon are linked in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.